The prairie stretched endlessly, painted in shades of amber and gold as the late afternoon sun spilled over the rolling fields. A tall figure stood at the edge of his ranch, his hat tilted low against the fading light. He was James Carter, known across the county as one of the wealthiest cattle ranchers in Texas. His ranch spanned thousands of acres, and his barns housed hundreds of horses and cattle. To the outside world, James had it all: wealth, land, influence, and respect. But anyone who looked closely enough would see something missing. The house behind him, though grand and beautifully built, carried a silence that echoed through every room. No warm laughter drifted from the kitchen. No soft humming accompanied the evening chores. James had lost his wife, Emily, 4 years ago during childbirth, leaving him with 2 boys, Matthew, now 8, and Daniel, only 6. Since then, James had tried to be both father and mother to his sons, but some wounds money could not heal. He raised them with discipline and care, but when the boys cried out for a mother at night, or when they asked simple questions like, "Why don't we have someone to tuck us in?" James found himself helpless. Ranch hands were loyal, but they weren't family. His sisters lived miles away, and his parents were long gone. More than once he had found himself sitting on the porch with a heavy heart, whispering into the night, "They need a mother, and I can't give them that." Meanwhile, in a small cottage at the edge of town, another life was unfolding in striking contrast. Sarah Miller, a young school teacher in her late 20s, sat at a worn wooden table counting the few coins she had left. Her hands trembled slightly as she realized the sum wouldn't cover her rent for the coming month. She was bright, compassionate, and deeply loved by her students, but her salary as a teacher barely kept food on the table. Sarah had grown up poor, but had always dreamed of making a difference in children's lives. Her late father, once a teacher himself, had inspired her to follow the same path, but inspiration didn't pay bills. Every day after long hours in the classroom, she returned home to a leaky roof, thin blankets, and the constant worry of eviction. Still, she never let her students see her struggles. At school, she wore a warm smile, patient and gentle, pouring her heart into every lesson. One such morning, Sarah noticed 2 boys sitting quietly in the corner of her classroom. Matthew and Daniel Carter. Unlike the other children, they carried a weight in their eyes, a kind of loneliness too deep for their age. While the other children boasted about their mothers baking pies or sewing clothes, the Carter boys always fell silent. Sarah felt her heart ache for them. She went out of her way to encourage them, to praise their drawings, to hold their hands when they felt shy. Slowly, she noticed them smiling again. Little did she know James Carter had observed it too. One day, he arrived earlier than usual to pick up his sons. Standing by the doorway, he watched quietly as Sarah knelt beside Daniel, tying his shoelaces with patient care while listening to Matthew's excited story about a picture he had drawn. She wasn't just teaching them, she was mothering them in ways he could not. James tipped his hat in gratitude as she looked up, surprised to see him. For a brief moment, their eyes met, his dark, tired gaze meeting her kind, resilient one. She offered him a smile, the kind that carried warmth despite her own exhaustion. James felt something stir within him, something he hadn't felt since Emily's passing. But Sarah knew better than to let her imagination wander. He was a wealthy rancher, respected and admired. She was a poor teacher barely making ends meet. They lived in 2 very different worlds, and she couldn't dare to hope. Still, that evening, as James rode back home with his sons, he found himself replaying the scene in his mind. The gentle way she tied Daniel's shoes, the way she encouraged Matthew to be proud of his drawing, and the rare laughter it brought out in his boys. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of possibility. At his ranch, after tucking the boys into bed, James sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames. He thought about what his sons needed, not just a caretaker, but someone who would love them, guide them, and give them the warmth they'd been missing. His wealth could provide shelter, food, and comfort, but it could never replace the tender presence of a mother. And then there was Sarah Miller, struggling for stability, yet rich in kindness, patience, and love. A thought crossed his mind, bold and unexpected. She needs shelter. My boys need a mother. Perhaps, just perhaps, we could heal each other's lives. James Carter was not a man who wasted time once his mind was made up. He was direct, sometimes to the point of being blunt, but always sincere. He had faced storms on the prairie, loss in his heart, and the burden of raising two sons alone. And now he knew he had to make a choice not just for himself but for his children. Far across town, Sarah lay awake in her small, cold room, staring at the cracked ceiling. She thought of Matthew and Daniel, their innocent smiles slowly returning under her care. She thought of Mr. Carter, quiet yet commanding, with eyes that seemed to carry both strength and sorrow. She didn't know it yet, but their worlds were about to collide in a way neither could have predicted. The winds across the prairie carried more than the scent of cattle and dust that night. They carried the beginning of a story, one of need, survival, and an unexpected proposal that would change both their lives forever. The Carter Ranch stretched as far as the eye could see. At dawn, the sky burned pink and orange, and the sound of cattle lowing filled the air. The ranch hands were already at work, guiding herds, repairing fences, and preparing for the day ahead. Life on the ranch was never quiet, never slow, and never easy. But for James Carter, the wealth and prestige of his land felt hollow when he walked back into his house each night. His home was a sprawling white ranch-style mansion with polished wooden floors, tall windows, and a grand staircase. It was the kind of house anyone in town would envy. But to James, the silence inside was unbearable. The walls didn't echo with children's laughter the way they used to when Emily was alive. Back then, Emily's warm voice floated through the halls, her laughter filling the rooms, her hands working gently to hold their small family together. Since her passing, the house had become something else entirely, a shell, vast and cold, filled with memories that haunted him. James had tried to be enough for his sons. He woke them in the mornings, made sure they had clean clothes, and even learned to braid Daniel's hair when he grew restless without his mother's touch. But at the end of each day, he knew he was failing at something only Emily could have given them, that tender presence only a mother carries. The boys rarely complained. Matthew was old enough to understand loss, though he didn't always talk about it. He carried his grief quietly, in the way his eyes lingered on other children with mothers. Daniel, on the other hand, still asked painful questions. One evening, while James tucked him into bed, Daniel looked up with wide, innocent eyes and asked, "Papa, why don't we have a mommy like the other kids?" James froze, his hand resting on the blanket. His throat tightened. He wanted to answer, but the words stuck like thorns. He finally said, "Your mama loved you both more than anything in this world. She would be here if she could." Daniel frowned. "But why can't we have another one? Maybe someone else could be our mommy now?" James swallowed hard, his chest aching. Out of the mouths of children came truths that cut deeper than any blade. He kissed Daniel's forehead, turned out the lamp, and left the room with heavy steps. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall, pressing his palm to his eyes. That was his dilemma. He could provide his sons with everything money could buy: fine clothes, toys, a grand home, the best schooling. But when it came to what mattered most, he was powerless. Love, warmth, a mother's touch. Those weren't things that could be purchased or demanded. Town gossip didn't help. In gatherings, people whispered, "When will James Carter remarry? He's rich enough, handsome enough. Surely he could have his pick." Some even offered their daughters names. But James wasn't a man who thought of marriage as business. He had married Emily for love, not convenience, and the thought of replacing her with someone shallow and insincere made him recoil. Still, the problem remained. His boys needed a mother, and the ache in his own heart whispered that he too needed companionship, though he'd buried that truth deep under duty and grief. It was during these restless nights that Sarah Miller's face began to drift into his thoughts. The way she bent down to Matthew's level, listening as though his little stories were treasures. The patience with which she tied Daniel's shoes. The smile she gave James that day, not one of admiration for his wealth but of simple kindness. He sat by the fireplace many evenings, staring at the flames as the ranch grew quiet. Thoughts churned in his mind. She's poor. She's struggling. She deserves more than what life has given her. And my boys, they need her warmth. But then another voice countered. What right do I have to ask her? Would she even accept? She might think I see her as nothing more than a solution, a bargain. Yet the thought wouldn't leave him. The next day, as James rode out on horseback, he found himself reflecting on what kind of man he was. He was known in the county for being hardworking, honest, and steady. His fortune hadn't come by accident but by years of sweat and labor, through dust storms and droughts. He had fought to build this life for his sons. But what good was it all if they still went to bed longing for something he couldn't give? That evening, he stopped by town earlier than usual. He tied his horse outside the schoolhouse just as classes ended. From the doorway, he watched Sarah gather her things. She looked tired, her shoulders sagging, her dress worn thin. Yet when the children filed out, she still gave each one a smile, wishing them well. Matthew and Daniel ran to her for a quick hug before heading toward their father. James noticed how naturally it happened, how his sons reached for her the way flowers leaned toward the sun. His chest tightened. As they left, Sarah caught his gaze. "They're good boys, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "You're raising them well." James tipped his hat but couldn't find words. He wanted to tell her the truth. "No, I'm not raising them well enough. They're missing something. They're missing you." Instead, he nodded, thanked her, and walked away with his sons. That night, after he tucked the boys into bed, James returned to his study. He poured himself a glass of whiskey but let it sit untouched on the desk. His thoughts wrestled with one another. He had always been a man who made decisions firmly, decisively, but this was different. This wasn't about cattle or business. This was about hearts, his sons, his own, and possibly Sarah Miller's. He whispered into the quiet, "They need a mother. And she needs shelter. Maybe God's put her in our path for a reason." The idea, once fragile, began to harden into determination. He knew he would have to be careful, respectful. He couldn't force her into anything, nor could he insult her pride. But he also knew that he couldn't ignore the possibility. James Carter, the rich cowboy who had conquered storms and built an empire, now faced the greatest dilemma of his life: how to ask a poor, proud teacher to step into his world, his home, and his heart. The flames in the fireplace crackled, casting shadows across his face. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find a way to speak to her. Sarah Miller woke before the sun rose, as she did every morning. The small cottage she rented sat at the far end of town, tucked between an old barn and a crooked fence. The roof leaked when it rained, and the walls were thin enough for winter's chill to seep through, but it was all she could afford. She pulled her threadbare shawl around her shoulders and lit the small stove, counting the last of the firewood stacked in the corner. The kettle hissed faintly as she boiled water for tea, though she had no sugar to sweeten it. Her cupboards were nearly empty, a half loaf of stale bread, a few potatoes, and a tin of beans. She would make do what she always did. Sarah had grown used to stretching little into enough, though it wore on her body and her spirit. When she sat at the small table with her cup of weak tea, she pulled out her worn leather purse and emptied its contents. A few coins clinked onto the surface. She counted them once, twice, then a third time, as though hoping the number would magically increase. It didn't. Rent was due in a week, and she was already short. Her stomach tightened at the thought. Sarah had chosen this life. She could have married young, as many girls her age had. Suitors had come and gone, most of them farmers or tradesmen looking for a wife to keep their homes. But Sarah had dreams, not of wealth or grandeur, but of purpose. Her father, a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse, had inspired her to follow the same path. He had always said, "Knowledge is the one gift no one can take from you. Sarah, share it, and you'll change lives." When her parents passed away, her father from illness, her mother not long after from grief, Sarah carried that dream forward. She studied, worked, and became the school teacher of their small town. She poured her heart into her students, giving them the encouragement and guidance she once received. But noble dreams rarely paid well. The school board gave her just enough to scrape by, and with the rising cost of food and rent, she was slipping further behind each month. Still, Sarah never let her students see her struggle. Each morning, she arrived at school with her hair neatly tied back, her dress pressed as best as she could manage, and her voice warm and patient. She greeted every child by name, listened to their stories, and offered encouragement even when her own heart was heavy. Among her students, Matthew and Daniel Carter stood out. Their quiet eyes, their hesitance to join in the laughter of the other children, she recognized that kind of loneliness. It was the same one she carried when her parents died. She went out of her way to show them kindness, not out of pity, but out of genuine care. They needed it. One day, when the other children were drawing pictures of their families, Matthew had hesitated. His paper remained blank while the others sketched mothers, fathers, and siblings. Sarah crouched beside him and asked gently, "What's wrong, Matthew?" He whispered, "I don't know what to draw. Other kids have a mom. We don't." The words pierced Sarah's heart. She squeezed his small hand and said softly, "Then why don't you draw the people who love you most? Your papa, your brother, that's still family, and family comes in all kinds of shapes." He gave her a small smile, picked up his pencil, and began to draw. Moments like these reminded Sarah why she endured the hardships. Her students, especially children like Matthew and Daniel, were the reason she got out of bed each day, no matter how cold or hungry she felt. But when the school day ended, reality returned. Walking home along the dusty road, she would see the difference between her life and others. Mothers waiting for their children, families heading home to warm meals and laughter. Sarah returned to silence. She had no husband to lean on, no family to share her burdens. Only the flickering lantern in her small cottage greeted her at night. Some evenings she sat at her table with her lesson books, trying to distract herself from the gnawing in her stomach. Other nights she wept quietly, fearing the day her landlord would finally lose patience and evict her. Where would she go then? Teachers didn't earn enough to save. The thought of homelessness weighed on her like a shadow she couldn't shake. It wasn't just money, though. Sarah longed for something more: stability, companionship, perhaps even love. She would never admit it out loud. But when she tucked the Carter boys' collars or smoothed their hair, she sometimes imagined what it would feel like to have children of her own, to have a home where she wasn't alone. But she quickly reminded herself that such dreams were luxuries for women with better fortunes. She had chosen a path of sacrifice. Her duty was to her students, to her calling. She couldn't afford to waste time on fanciful hopes. And yet, every time James Carter appeared at the schoolhouse, tall and steady, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, Sarah felt something stir within her. He was a man of means, of strength. But there was something in his eyes, too. A tiredness, a sorrow she recognized. She knew grief when she saw it, and James carried it like an invisible weight. She told herself not to dwell on it. He was from a world far above hers. He owned land, wealth, and influence.
She had nothing but her small wage and her books.
A man like him would never look twice at a poor teacher like her. Still, in her quietest moments, Sarah found herself thinking of the way he watched his sons with such care, the way he treated her with respect instead of condescension. She wondered if he noticed her at all. And she wondered most of all if their lives, so different on the surface, were perhaps tied together by the same unspoken longing. His for a mother for his children, hers for shelter and belonging. On a cold night, as she lay in bed listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the walls, Sarah whispered into the darkness, "Lord, I don't ask for riches. I only ask for a place where I belong. Somewhere I don't have to fight alone anymore." She didn't know it yet, but the answer to that prayer was already forming in the heart of a cowboy sitting miles away, staring into the fire and wondering if the poor teacher with the gentle smile might be the missing piece his family needed. The first true meeting between James Carter and Sarah Miller didn't happen in a ballroom or over polite introductions at a town social. It happened in the dusty, sunlit corner of a small schoolhouse. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Sarah was teaching arithmetic to her restless class. The children sat at wooden desks, their slates smeared with chalk dust, while she stood at the front, writing numbers neatly on the board. Outside, the cicadas droned in the heat, and the faint sound of hooves echoed from the road leading into town. Matthew and Daniel sat quietly near the back. Matthew chewed his pencil eraser while Daniel tried to copy the sums with a frown. Sarah noticed their struggles. She walked down the aisle, her skirt brushing lightly against the floorboards, and crouched beside them. "Having trouble, Daniel?" she asked softly. The little boy looked up at her, his wide blue eyes clouded with worry. "It's too hard, Miss Miller. I can't do it." Sarah smiled, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "It's not too hard. You're just thinking too fast. Slow down. Let's do it together." Her patience calmed him. Daniel leaned closer as she explained the steps, and when he finally wrote the correct answer on his slate, she patted his hand. "See, you can do it. You just needed someone to remind you." Matthew grinned proudly for his brother, and Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. These boys, quiet, reserved, carrying something unspoken in their eyes, reminded her of herself as a child. She couldn't help but give them extra care. It was then she sensed a presence at the door. She turned her head and saw a tall figure standing in the threshold, hat in hand. James Carter. The afternoon sunlight framed him, highlighting his broad shoulders, weathered face, and steady gaze. His boots were dusty from the ride, and his shirt clung to him after a long day's work. Yet even with his rough edges, there was a quiet dignity about him that made Sarah's breath hitch for a moment. She rose to her feet, smoothing her skirt. "Mr. Carter," she greeted politely. "You're here early." James nodded, his voice deep and even. "Finished work sooner than expected. Thought I'd fetch the boys myself." His sons lit up when they saw him. Daniel ran toward him, wrapping small arms around his leg, while Matthew followed more reservedly, though his smile was no less genuine. James bent down, ruffling their hair, his stern expression softening for only them. Sarah watched quietly. For all his wealth and stoicism, James was most human in these moments with his children. She saw the love in the way he bent to Daniel's level, the pride in the way he listened when Matthew showed him a chalk drawing. James glanced up, and for a brief heartbeat his gaze met Sarah's. The schoolhouse suddenly felt smaller, warmer, though neither of them spoke. There was a recognition there, two people who carried burdens heavier than most could see. Finally, James broke the silence. "They give you any trouble?" Sarah shook her head with a faint smile. "Not at all. They're bright boys. They just need encouragement sometimes, but they're eager to learn." James studied her for a moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. "I appreciate the patience you show him. Not everyone takes the time." She lowered her eyes, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Compliments weren't often directed her way, especially not from men like James Carter. "Every child needs someone to believe in them," she said softly. There was a pause. The air seemed charged with unspoken words. But before either could continue, other children began rushing out of the classroom, eager to head home. Sarah excused herself to gather her books, breaking the moment. James straightened, taking his sons by the shoulders. "Come on, boys. Let's head home." As they walked toward the door, Daniel turned back and waved at Sarah. "Bye, Miss Miller." She waved back, her smile reaching her eyes. "Goodbye, Daniel." "Goodbye, Matthew." James tipped his hat again before stepping out into the sun, his boots thudding against the wooden steps. Sarah watched them leave, a strange heaviness settling in her chest. Something about his presence lingered even after he was gone. That evening, as Sarah walked home, she replayed the moment in her mind. The way his eyes had met hers, steady, intense, almost searching. She told herself not to think too much of it. He was James Carter, wealthy rancher, respected and admired. She was Sarah Miller, a poor teacher barely keeping a roof over her head. They lived in two different worlds, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls between their worlds had thinned, just a little in that schoolhouse doorway. Meanwhile, James rode back to the ranch with his sons. Daniel chattered about Miss Miller helping him with his sums, while Matthew proudly showed the drawing he had made under her encouragement. James listened, his heart tugged by the way their faces lit up when they spoke of her. That night, after tucking them in, James lingered by the fireplace again. He poured himself a drink but didn't touch it, staring instead at the flames. He remembered the way she had bent patiently beside Daniel, the softness in her voice, the warmth in her eyes. His sons needed that, and though he hardly admitted it, perhaps he needed it too. Leaning back in his chair, James muttered under his breath, "Maybe it's time I stop fighting this emptiness. Maybe." He let the thought hang, unfinished. Outside, the prairie winds whispered against the windows, as though carrying with them the promise of a beginning neither James nor Sarah yet fully understood. Their lives had brushed together in the simplest of ways. A schoolhouse doorway, a kind word, a lingering glance, but sometimes the smallest meetings plant the largest seeds. And for James Carter, that meeting was the spark that would ignite a decision bold enough to change all their lives. The following days weighed heavily on James Carter's mind. The seed of an idea, reckless, unconventional, but undeniably persistent, had taken root. Every evening he returned home, and every evening the same thoughts haunted him. His sons needed a mother, and Sarah Miller needed more than the crumbling shelter she barely managed to keep. It wasn't just pity driving him. James had seen her spirit, her kindness, and the way his boys gravitated toward her warmth as though they had always known her. He admired her strength, the quiet dignity with which she carried her struggles. And though he barely admitted it even to himself, he had begun to feel something stir in his own chest when he thought of her, something he hadn't felt since Emily. But James was not a man of dithering. When he made a decision, he acted. So one crisp Saturday morning, after finishing his ranch work early, he saddled his horse and rode into town. His hat brim shaded his eyes, and though his expression was calm, his heart beat heavier than usual. This was not a cattle deal or a land dispute. This was his family's future. He found Sarah at the schoolhouse, though classes weren't in session. She was at her desk, papers spread before her, carefully grading arithmetic exercises. The light from the window caught in her hair, making it gleam like polished chestnut. She looked up in surprise as he stepped through the doorway. "Mr. Carter," she said, rising to her feet. "This is unexpected. Is something wrong with the boys?" He shook his head, removing his hat and holding it in his hands. "No, ma'am. They're fine, more than fine, thanks to you." Her brow furrowed, curiosity and a faint blush touching her cheeks. "You're kind to say so. But what brings you here?" James cleared his throat, shifting his weight. He was a man used to plain speech, and now was no time to hide behind hesitation. He stepped closer, his boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. "I came to speak with you, Miss Miller, about something important." She clasped her hands in front of her, nerves pricking. His gaze was steady, unwavering, and she felt as though he could see straight through her. "Go on," she said quietly. James drew a slow breath. "I won't dance around it. You know my situation. I'm raising 2 boys alone. They're good boys, but they need more than I can give. They need a mother's care." He paused, the weight of his words filling the air. "And you need shelter, stability. I've seen it. I know life hasn't been easy for you." Her eyes widened, her cheeks flushing. Shame flickered in her chest. Shame that her struggles were so visible even to a man like him. She opened her mouth, but James raised a hand gently. "Please let me finish," he said. She nodded, her throat tight. He took another step closer, his voice firm but not unkind. "I came here today to ask you to consider something most would call unusual. A proposal, if you will. Not of love, at least not yet, but of partnership. I need a mother for my sons, and you need shelter. I can give you a home, safety, and the chance to build a family. And in return, my boys would have the care they've been missing, and I'd have a companion I respect." The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears. His words had been direct, almost shockingly so, yet there was no mockery, no arrogance in them. Only sincerity. She finally found her voice, though it trembled. "Mr. Carter, James, do you hear yourself? You're asking me to marry you not for love, but for necessity." His jaw tightened. "I know how it sounds. But I've lived long enough to know that love can grow. Respect, care, and trust when those are the roots it grows from. I see those roots in you, and I believe if you gave us the chance, you might see them in me too." Sarah turned away, pressing her hands against the desk to steady herself. The room spun. Marriage had always been something she imagined coming with affection, with courtship, not with an offer that felt half like a business arrangement. And yet his words struck a chord she couldn't deny. He wasn't wrong. She did need shelter. She did long for companionship, and deep down she had already begun to care for Matthew and Daniel. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "And what about your heart, James? What about Emily? Am I to live in her shadow forever?" James froze, then stepped closer, his voice gentler now. "Emily will always be part of me. But she's gone. My boys can't live in her memory alone. They need someone present. I need someone present. I don't expect you to replace her. No one could. But you could become someone new to us. Someone we all need." Tears pricked Sarah's eyes. She turned to face him, her lips trembling. "Do you know what people will say? That I married you for your wealth, that you chose me out of pity." He set his hat on the desk and looked her directly in the eye. "Let them say what they will. They don't know me, and they don't know you. I'm not offering this out of pity, Sarah. I'm offering it because I believe we can build something real. Maybe not perfect, maybe not what storybooks promise, but something steady, something good." Her breath caught. The sincerity in his voice left little room for doubt. He wasn't a man who spoke lightly. His proposal was raw, stripped of frills and flattery, but it was genuine. Still, fear gnawed at her. Could she really step into his world? Could she leave behind the life she knew, however difficult, for one she barely understood? She lowered her gaze, her hands trembling. "I don't know, James. I don't know if I can make such a choice so quickly." He nodded solemnly, reaching for his hat. "I don't expect an answer today. Think on it. Pray on it if you wish. I just needed you to know my heart. The offer is there. For you, and for my boys." With that, he placed his hat back on his head and turned toward the door. Before leaving, he paused and added quietly, "Whatever you decide, I respect you, Sarah, always." And then he was gone. Leaving the schoolhouse silent once more, Sarah sank into her chair, her heart racing. She buried her face in her hands, torn between fear and hope. His words echoed in her mind. "I need a mother for my sons, and you need shelter." It was not the proposal she had dreamed of as a girl, but perhaps, she thought, life had never been about dreams. Perhaps it was about finding strength where life planted you, and love where you least expected it. Sarah Miller could barely sleep that night. The words James Carter had spoken lingered in her mind like an echo she couldn't silence. "I need a mother for my sons, and you need shelter." It was such a practical proposal, unromantic, almost transactional. Yet there had been something in his eyes, something steady and earnest, that made her pulse race in a way she couldn't explain. She tossed and turned on her narrow cot, staring up at the cracked ceiling of her tiny rented room. The wind whistled through a gap in the window frame, chilling her to the bone. She pulled the thin quilt tighter around her shoulders, but no amount of fabric could protect her from the storm inside her. Could she really do it? Marry a man she barely knew beyond brief conversations and the occasional encounter in town? Could she take on the role of mother to two boys who were not her own, when she was barely holding herself together? Her pride whispered sharply in her ear. "He offered you a home like a man offering charity to a beggar. Do you really want to accept such pity?" But another voice, quieter, softer, yet persistent, spoke in the depths of her heart. It wasn't pity. It was need. He needs you. His boys need you. And perhaps you need them too. She buried her face in her pillow, tears pricking her eyes. She hated being torn in two. All her life she had stood on her own feet, surviving hardship with little more than grit and determination. To suddenly step into someone else's wealth and protection felt like surrender. But surrender to what? Safety, belonging, love perhaps, if it ever grew. The next morning she tried to lose herself in routine. She tidied the schoolhouse, set out lesson plans, and corrected homework. The familiar scratch of chalk and the scent of old wood gave her a sense of order. Yet even as she worked, her thoughts drifted back to James. When the children arrived, she smiled as best she could, guiding them through arithmetic and reading. But her eyes kept straying to Matthew and Daniel, James's boys. Matthew's serious focus reminded her so much of his father, while Daniel's easy laughter filled the room with light. And every time one of them looked up at her with unguarded trust, her chest ached. She thought, if I said yes, they would be mine. In name, if not in blood. Could I love them as my own? Later that afternoon, when the children had gone, Sarah lingered at her desk. The sun slanted through the windows, golden dust motes drifting lazily in the air. She pressed her palms together, resting her chin on them. Her friend and fellow teacher, Clara Jenkins, poked her head through the door. "You look miles away, Sarah. Something troubling you?" Sarah hesitated, then sighed. Clara was one of the few people she trusted enough to confide in. "I received an unexpected proposal." Clara's eyes widened and she hurried inside, shutting the door behind her. "A proposal? From who?" Sarah swallowed. "James Carter," Clara gasped. "The rancher? Landowning James Carter?" Her voice was hushed but brimming with astonishment. "What did he say?" Sarah recounted his words. The honesty, the bluntness, the strange mix of tenderness and practicality. Clara listened, her brow furrowed, her hands clasped tightly. When Sarah finished, Clara leaned back. "Well, that's not exactly the stuff of fairy tales, is it?" Sarah gave a bitter laugh. "No, it isn't. But," Clara continued, her eyes softening, "it's real. James Carter's a good man, Sarah. Folks say he's stern, but they also say he's fair. His boys adore you already, don't they?" "They do," Sarah admitted. "And you?" Clara tilted her head. "You care for them too, I can see it. Don't deny it." Sarah lowered her gaze, guilt and longing tangling in her chest. "I do care. But caring for them as a teacher is one thing. Becoming their mother is another." Clara reached across the desk, covering Sarah's hand with her own. "Listen to me. You've worked yourself to the bone just to survive. I see it, even if you try to hide it. James isn't offering pity. He's offering partnership, stability, and maybe, if you let yourself hope, love." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "But what if it fails, Clara? What if I step into his house and I don't belong? What if his boys resent me? Or I can't measure up to the memory of his late wife? What if people whisper that I married him for his money? Clara squeezed her hand firmly. People will whisper no matter what you do. You can't live your life by their tongues. As for the rest, she paused, her expression thoughtful. Life is risk, Sarah, but some risks are worth taking. That night, Sarah walked home alone, Clara's words echoing in her ears. The moon hung high, silvering the dusty road beneath her feet. She hugged her shawl close, the evening air biting her cheeks. Her small rented room awaited her, cold and bare. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the worn floorboards, her heart heavy. James Carter had offered her more than just a roof. He had offered her a place, in his home, in his family, perhaps in his heart if time allowed. She whispered into the stillness, Lord, what should I do? Silence answered, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. And yet, deep inside her, something began to shift. She wasn't ready to give her answer. Not yet. But for the first time, she could see herself in his home, sitting at his table, reading to his boys by the fire. And though fear still gripped her, hope flickered too, fragile, uncertain but alive. Sarah had thought her hesitation was private, hidden behind the quiet walls of her little room in the schoolhouse. But in a town as small as theirs, secrets traveled faster than the wind across the prairie. Within days, whispers began to spread. It started in the general store, where two women pretended to browse bolts of fabric while sneaking glances at her. Did you hear? One murmured loud enough for Sarah to catch. James Carter proposing to that poor schoolteacher, imagine. The other clucked her tongue. She's clever, that one. Teaching his boys by day, and then stepping right into his house by night. Mark my words, she's after his land, not his love. Heat burned in Sarah's cheeks. She set her basket down and hurried out, her pride stung, her heart aching. It was worse at the schoolhouse. Some of the children carried their parents' gossip in their mouths like parroted phrases. Miss Miller? One boy asked innocently. Are you really going to marry Matthew and Daniel's pa? My ma says you're just looking for a rich husband. Sarah forced a smile, though her throat tightened. That's enough, children. Back to your books. But when she was alone, the tears came. She hadn't even given James an answer, and already the town had judged her guilty. Meanwhile, James faced his own storm. At the feed store, old men leaned on sacks of grain and gave him pointed looks. Heard you're planning to marry the schoolteacher, one drawled. Didn't think you'd be so desperate. James's jaw clenched. My personal affairs are no business of yours. But the man just smirked. A wealthy rancher and a penniless teacher? Folks will talk, Carter. They'll say she tricked you or that you pitied her. James turned on his heel and left without another word, though inside frustration boiled. He had expected resistance, perhaps even judgment, but hearing it spoken aloud still stung. The hardest part, however, was at home. Matthew, the elder of his boys, had overheard the gossip too. One evening, as James tightened a fence post outside, Matthew approached, his brow furrowed. Pa? He asked hesitantly, is it true? Are you going to marry Miss Miller? James set down his hammer, crouching so he could meet his son's eyes. I asked her, yes, but she hasn't answered me yet. Matthew's lips pressed into a thin line. I like her. She's kind, but what about Ma? Won't she be angry in heaven? The words pierced James like a blade. He pulled Matthew into his arms, his voice thick. Your Ma loved you and Daniel more than anything. She'd want you to be happy. She'd want you to have someone to care for you. Miss Miller could never replace her, but she could be part of our family in a new way. Matthew was silent for a long time, then finally nodded. If you think it's right, Pa. That night when the boys were asleep, James sat on the porch staring out at the dark horizon. He thought of Emily, of her laughter, her touch, the way she used to hum while kneading bread. He would never forget her. But he knew holding on to her memory too tightly was like gripping a shadow. It gave nothing to the living. Sarah's face drifted into his mind, her eyes soft and uncertain, her strength shining even through her struggles. He wanted her beside him not out of charity, but because something in him recognized something in her. Two broken pieces that might together make a whole. Yet doubts gnawed at him. What if the town's whispers poisoned her heart? What if she turned away from him? Too proud to bear the rumors. What if, deep down, she never loved him? Sarah, too, wrestled with doubt. One Sunday after church, she found herself cornered by Mrs. Hensley, a stout woman with a sharp tongue. "Miss Miller," she said with a tight smile. "We hear you've caught the eye of Mr. Carter, quite the achievement." Her tone dripped with false sweetness. "But tell me, dear, is it his heart you're after, or his fortune?" Sarah stiffened. "That's not fair, Mrs. Hensley." "Oh, I don't mean offense," the woman replied, though her eyes glittered with malice. "It's just folks say things. They'll wonder if a lady like you with no family and no means might be looking for comfort in the wrong places." Sarah's hands trembled, but she lifted her chin. "If I ever choose to marry, it will not be for anyone's approval but God's. Good day." "Mrs. Hensley." She walked away, her back straight, though her insides churned. By the time she reached her little room, the strength had drained out of her. She sank onto the bed, her hands covering her face. The whispers cut deep because they struck at her greatest fear. That maybe, just maybe, they were right. That she wasn't worthy of James Carter. That she would never be more than the poor teacher who stumbled into his wealth. Yet when she thought of his boys, of their trust and need, something inside her resisted the lie. And when she thought of James himself, the way his voice had softened when he spoke of respect, she wondered if perhaps the truth lay not in the town's judgment, but in the bond quietly growing between them. Still, fear is stubborn. It lingered in her chest, a constant shadow. She wanted to believe she could be strong enough, brave enough to accept his offer. But what if she stepped into his home and failed them all? The doubts were heavy, pressing on both sides, and yet, though neither knew it, their struggles mirrored each other. Both feared the whispers. Both wrestled with pride and grief. Both stood on the edge of a choice that could change their lives forever. The question was simple, yet monumental. Would they have the courage to silence the world and trust in what they felt? The weeks that followed were quiet on the surface, but beneath that quiet, something was shifting. Sarah had not yet given James her answer. She couldn't, not while her pride and her fear still waged war within her. But life has a way of moving forward whether hearts are ready or not. And every day brought small moments that tugged her closer to the Carter family. It began with Daniel. One rainy afternoon, when the schoolhouse rattled with the sound of thunder, Daniel had lingered after class. His little boots were muddy, his hair damp from the dash he'd made to the door. He clutched a crumpled paper in his fist, eyes downcast. "What is it, Daniel?" Sarah asked gently, kneeling to meet his gaze. He shuffled his feet. "It's my writing. Pa says I gotta practice, but I'm not good at it." Sarah took the paper and saw the messy scrawl, letters too large, some turned backward. She smiled warmly. "Do you know what I see? I see effort. And effort means you're learning." His eyes lifted, searching hers. "Do you think maybe you could help me, just for a little bit?" She hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Of course." So Daniel stayed while she guided his hand, showing him how to shape letters slowly and carefully. The storm raged outside, but in that little room, there was only the boy's determined grin and Sarah's quiet encouragement. When James arrived later to collect his sons, he paused at the door unnoticed and watched them. Daniel was leaning against Sarah's shoulder, proudly holding up a paper with his name written properly for the first time. Sarah's smile lit her face, warm and genuine. James's chest tightened. It wasn't just the sight of his son's progress that stirred him. It was the way Sarah looked at Daniel as if he truly mattered. As if he were hers. That night, after putting the boys to bed, James sat by the fire, staring at the flames. He thought of Sarah's laughter, the kindness in her eyes, the courage in her voice when she stood up to gossip. Affection was creeping into his heart. Unbidden but welcome. For Sarah, the change came gradually, through moments of unexpected tenderness. One evening, she had been walking home from the schoolhouse when her ankle twisted on the uneven road. She stumbled, gasping, pain shooting up her leg. Before she could regain her balance, James appeared on horseback, reining in sharply. "Sarah!" he called, concern etched in his features. He dismounted in one swift motion, his hand steadying her. I'm fine," she insisted, though her face was pale. "You're not," he said firmly. Without asking, he lifted her into his arms, cradling her against his chest as though she weighed nothing. Her breath caught. She wanted to protest, to insist on her independence, but the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear silenced her. She felt safe, safer than she had in years. He carried her all the way to her small rented room, setting her gently on the bed. "Rest, I'll send Clara to check on you." As he turned to go, she caught his sleeve. James. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," she whispered. Something flickered in his eyes, a softness she hadn't expected. He nodded once, then left. But the warmth of his arms lingered long after the door closed. The boys, too, began to draw her closer into their circle. Daniel often brought her little treasures. A smooth stone, a wildflower, once even a feather he declared was good luck. Matthew was slower to trust, but one afternoon when Sarah praised his careful arithmetic, he smiled shyly and whispered, "Pa says you're smart. I think you're kind too." Her heart swelled at the words. She realized that in their innocent way the boys were already weaving her into their family, and she didn't mind. Still, doubts remained, though they softened with each passing day. At church one Sunday, Sarah sat in her usual pew, head bowed. When the service ended, she rose to leave, but James and his boys were waiting at the aisle. "Walk with us?" James asked simply. The stares of the congregation burned at her back, but when Daniel slipped his small hand into hers, her resolve melted. Together they walked into the sunlight, the boys between them. For a brief moment, Sarah let herself imagine this was her life, family, companionship, belonging. Later, as they reached the crossroads, James touched the brim of his hat. "Thank you, Sarah, for today." She looked at him, startled. "For what?" "For walking beside me despite what people say." His gaze was steady, his voice low. "You've more courage than most folks in that church combined." Her cheeks warmed, but she couldn't find the words to reply. Instead, she smiled softly, and that was enough. Over time, the quiet affection between them grew roots. It wasn't grand gestures or sweeping romance, and it was small things, steady things. James leaving a basket of fresh eggs at her door without a word. Sarah mending a tear in Daniel's shirt, her stitches neat and careful. James lingering after school to ask about her day. Sarah laughing, truly laughing, when Daniel told a silly joke. The sound lighting up James's heart like a lantern in the dark. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of gold, Sarah stood outside the schoolhouse, watching the Carter boys chase each other across the yard. James stood beside her, arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "They're happy," she said softly. "They are," he agreed. She glanced at him, her voice trembling. "And you?" He turned his head, meeting her gaze. The fading light caught in his eyes, making them glow. "Happier than I've been in a long time." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Sarah's heart pounded, her chest tightening with emotions she dared not name. She looked away, flustered, but not before she caught the gentleness in his expression, a gentleness meant only for her. Affection had taken root, fragile but undeniable. Sarah still hadn't spoken her answer, but she knew it was no longer just about shelter or duty. Something real was forming between them, something that neither gossip nor fear could easily erase. For the first time since James's proposal, Sarah felt the possibility of happiness, not the distant dream of it, but the living, breathing promise of it. Right there in the glances, the touches, the laughter they shared. And though neither said the words aloud, both of them knew love was beginning to bloom. The question had lingered in Sarah's heart for weeks, a heavy weight she carried with her wherever she went. James Carter had asked for her hand, not with pretty words or romantic promises, but with honesty, plain and bare. "I need a mother for my sons, and you need shelter." Those words had both unsettled and steadied her, but now, after the gossip, the doubts, and the unexpected tenderness, Sarah knew she couldn't keep her answer hidden forever. It came to her one evening, as she sat by the dim lamplight in her small rented room. The wind rattled the thin walls and rain seeped through a crack in the ceiling, dripping steadily into a bowl she had placed beneath it. She shivered under her shawl, staring at the bare shelves, the meager life she had scraped together. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. She had always told herself she was strong, that she could survive on her own. And she had. But was survival all she wanted? The faces of Matthew and Daniel rose in her mind. Daniel's eager grin when he wrote his name correctly, Matthew's hesitant trust when he whispered that she was kind. And James, steady, serious James, whose voice had softened when he spoke of respect, whose arms had carried her when she stumbled, whose eyes told her things he rarely voiced aloud. Sarah pressed her hands to her chest. This wasn't just about needing shelter. It was about needing them, the boys, the man, the home that had slowly begun to feel like hers, even from a distance. She stood abruptly, resolve hardening inside her. She would not let fear rule her anymore. The next morning dawned clear. The storm swept away, leaving the air fresh and cool. Sarah dressed carefully, smoothing her plain dress, tying her hair back neatly. She took one last look around her little room, the cracked walls, the patched quilt, the small pile of books she treasured. She felt no bitterness, only a strange sense of farewell. Then she walked the road to the Carter Ranch, each step steady despite the quick beat of her heart. The ranch spread wide before her, golden fields stretching to the horizon, cattle grazing in the distance. The white farmhouse stood solid, strong, like the man who kept it. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the sound of children's laughter carried on the breeze. Her throat tightened. She found James in the yard, repairing a wagon wheel. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, his hand steady as always. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, surprise flickering across his face. He set aside his tools and rose to his feet, wiping his hands on a rag. "Sarah," he said, his voice low but warm. "I wasn't expecting you." She clasped her hands together to still their trembling. "I needed to see you, to give you my answer." For a moment his eyes darkened with something unreadable. Hope, fear, longing, all tangled together. He nodded slowly. "Go on." Sarah drew a deep breath, her heart hammering. "When you asked me, I was frightened. Frightened of what people would say. Frightened of what it would mean for me, for your boys, for you. I told myself I was strong enough to stand alone, that I didn't need anyone's help. But the truth is," she faltered, then lifted her chin. "The truth is I don't want to stand alone anymore." His jaw tightened, his gaze locked on hers. She stepped closer, her voice steady now. "I care for Matthew and Daniel, more than I ever thought I could. And you, James, you've shown me a kind of respect I've rarely known. I don't know what the future will bring. I don't know if love will come quickly, or if it will grow slow like spring after a long winter. But I believe it will come, and I want to give it the chance." Her hands trembled as she spoke the final words. "Yes, James Carter, I'll marry you." For a long heartbeat, silence stretched between them. Then James exhaled, a sound almost like relief, and closed the distance between them in 2 strides. He took her hands in his, rough and warm, holding them as if they were something precious. "You've just made me the luckiest man alive," he said hoarsely. Sarah's eyes stung with tears. She laughed softly, trembling but smiling. "I thought you were supposed to be the practical one." His lips curved, the closest thing to a grin she'd seen on him. Even practical men can count their blessings. At that moment, Matthew and Daniel came running from the barn, their faces alight with curiosity. "Miss Miller," Daniel cried, skidding to a stop. "What are you doing here?" Sarah crouched down, her smile widening through her tears. "I came to give your father my answer." The boys exchanged glances, then looked up at James. "And?" Matthew asked, cautious but hopeful. James's voice softened. "She said yes." Daniel whooped with joy, flinging his arms around Sarah's neck. Matthew hesitated, then slowly, shyly wrapped his arms around her too. Sarah held them both, her heart overflowing. In that embrace, she knew her choice was right. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family. James stood above them, his eyes bright as he watched the 3 people he loved most already beginning to form a whole. He tipped his hat back, the weight of years of loneliness lifting from his shoulders. The whispers of the town, the doubts of the past. None of it mattered anymore. Sarah had chosen him. And he had chosen her. Together, they would build something steady, something good, and perhaps in time something beautiful. The Carter Ranch had never looked so alive. The wedding was simple, held beneath the wide blue sky with the golden fields stretching to the horizon and the scent of wildflowers drifting on the breeze. Sarah wore a modest cream dress Clara had helped her sew, her hair pulled back with a ribbon. James stood tall beside her, his dark suit pressed neatly, his hat respectfully removed. It wasn't a grand affair, just a gathering of neighbors, a preacher with kind eyes and 2 boys standing proudly at their father's side. And yet to Sarah it was perfect. When the preacher asked if she would take James Carter as her husband, her voice did not tremble as she said, "I will." When James spoke his vow, his voice was steady and strong. "I promise to respect you, to protect you, and to walk beside you all my days." The kiss they shared was brief, chaste but tender, a promise of what would grow between them. And when Daniel cheered and Matthew smiled shyly, Sarah laughed through her tears, joy swelling in her heart. Life after the wedding was not without its challenges. Sarah moved into the farmhouse, and at first the newness of it all overwhelmed her. The house was bigger than any place she had ever lived, filled with Emily's lingering touches. A quilt on the bed, a set of china carefully displayed. Sometimes Sarah felt like a guest in another woman's home, but James, true to his word, never compared her to the past. He gave her space to make the house her own. Together with the boys, she stitched new curtains, planted flowers by the porch, and added her books to the shelves. Slowly, the farmhouse began to feel less like Emily's memory and more like their shared future. At the table, laughter became common. Daniel's chatter filled the evenings, while Matthew's quiet wisdom often surprised them all. Sarah read to the boys by lamplight, her voice weaving stories that lulled them to sleep. James would linger in the doorway watching, his heart swelling with gratitude, and Sarah, once a woman who had only known survival, found herself blossoming in ways she had never thought possible. Of course, there were whispers still. Some neighbors continued to mutter that Sarah had married for security, that James had chosen out of desperation. But over time, the whispers lost their sting. For every cruel tongue, there was evidence of the truth. Sarah riding the pastures with James, helping tally the cattle with sharp, capable eyes. Sarah mending clothes, her laughter mingling with the boys. Sarah standing beside James at church, their hands brushing, their gazes soft. It became clear to anyone who looked closely that theirs was not a union of convenience but one of growing love. The turning point came one late autumn evening. The harvest was done, the air crisp with the promise of winter. Sarah and James sat on the porch after supper, the boys chasing fireflies in the yard. The lantern light flickered across Sarah's face, and James found himself watching her with quiet intensity. "You've changed this place," he said finally. She looked at him, surprised. "How do you mean?" His voice was low, rough with sincerity. "It was a house before. Now it's a home." Her throat tightened. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling slightly as they laced with his. "I was so afraid I'd never belong here," she whispered. "That I'd never be enough." James turned toward her fully, his hand warm and steady around hers. "Sarah, you're more than enough. You're exactly what we needed, what I needed." Her eyes stung with tears. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then James leaned in, brushing his lips against hers, not tentative, not uncertain, but with a depth that told her everything he had struggled to say aloud. When they parted, Sarah rested her forehead against his chest, her heart pounding, and for the first time, she felt not just safe but cherished. The months turned into years, and their love deepened. Sarah became not only the boys' teacher but their mother in every way that mattered. Daniel often declared proudly, "I've got the best ma in the whole world." Matthew, quieter but no less devoted, once left a note on her desk at school. "Thank you for being our family." James worked the ranch with renewed vigor, but he was no longer a man carrying his burdens alone. Sarah stood beside him, her strength matching his, her laughter lightening the hardest days. Together they built something stronger than either could have built alone. And love, the kind Sarah had once thought a childish dream, grew between them steadily, like roots sinking deep into the earth. It was not a fireworks blaze, but the steady warmth of a hearth, enduring and true. Years later, when neighbors looked at the Carter Ranch, they no longer spoke of pity or gossip. They spoke of family, of love born not from wealth or desperation, but from courage and choice. And when Sarah stood on the porch in the evenings, watching James with his arm around her shoulders and the boys grown tall before them, she knew the truth in her heart. Happily ever after was not a fairy tale. It was a choice made daily in small acts of love and respect. And she and James had chosen it together.